What we've got today is some examples from a book that we've just published called The Art and Science of Remote Teaching. And what this comes from is a fairly lengthy project that for me goes back my entire teaching career and for the last 11 years, the Corny-Low Brass Seminar. And then a lot of research that we've done, and then working with Julia Broome-Robinson, who's now a doctoral student at Arizona State. We put together a book that was both from the faculty teaching perspective and the student teaching perspective, and to draw on all the lessons learned and a lot of the interest in research that we've done in science, physiology, psychology, about how we learn, how our trombone works, and how we can actually apply that. So what we wanted to do is share some of the highlights with you. Now, this is going to be kind of a different sort of presentation, and this book is a different kind of book. It's not a method book. It's a book about teaching. It's not the only way to teach, but it's a way of putting it together to give you some ideas. So if you're interested in teaching, we'd encourage you to take a look at that. We're going to hit 4 sort of main topics here. And one of the things that we've done is kind of organize this process through some sort of sayings and funny stories. But, finding your groove in this, in how you learn and teach. Are we talking about more air or the right air? A section on how the tongue works, something we never talk about. And then finally, designing effective exercises. Right? So I'm the professor, so I'm going to start off and talk about this. There's a great line from a song that says, the refrain is, there's a fine line between a groove and a rut. And I think a lot of times we're talking about warm-up routines and we're talking about exercises and doing the same thing over and over and over again. And one of the things that we do is we learn that and then we make that permanent in our brain. And part of this is a function of what we call the natural learning process. Okay? And I'm not going to go into that in length, but this is how you learn how to walk and talk as an infant, by copying things and repeating things slowly. Okay? It's outlined in the 2 books that I've mentioned up here. If you haven't read these books and you intend on teaching, you need to go and get these 2 books and read them. They're both available in paperback, so there's absolutely no excuse. But the basic idea here is that there are 2 sides to the conscious brain. Okay? We have self 1, which is making decisions. What am I going to have for dinner? Am I going to go to the next concert? Okay? It's really good at that. It can do your math, it can do your taxes, but it is really terrible at operating your muscles. Self 2 can't do your taxes, can't think consciously, but it is really good at operating your muscles. And what it does is it watches for patterns of repetition. So when you repeat an activity, very carefully through using self 1 of your brain, say, I'm trying to do this thing, I'm going to do it again and again. After somewhere between 3 and 7 repetitions, self 2 grabs onto that and creates what's called a habit. And then suddenly you can do this. So if you've been around an infant that starts to learn how to walk, they're crawling one day, and what happens the next? They're running around, right? This happens incredibly fast. And this is how we learn what we call perceptual psychomotor activities. Well, that's a big fancy word for, say, here's fifth position. Okay? That is a perceived psychomotor activity. Okay? But when we repeat that over and over again, we learn it. So it has consequences. Now, that's the scholarly version. What you need to know about this is once you've established a habit, you can't change it. You have to replace it. So let's turn that around to something we can use.
All right. So the studio version of all this is basically we learn what we repeat, right? And if you practice something, it's going to become permanent, and so you better make sure you're practicing it the right way. Also, if you've been practicing something the wrong way, you have to practice it or repeat it enough times the correct way in order to replace your wrong habit that you formed. Habits can't be changed, they must be replaced through careful repetition, and it takes more focused effort because you've got that habit in place. So that's the sort of applied studio version.
So we can simplify this, and words matter. We'll come back to that as a concept later on. But one of the things, so for example, how many of you, now be honest, how many of you have come to a place in a piece and you play the same wrong note every time, right? Okay? You learned it that way. So you repeated that, it became a habit, and you know how hard it is to fix that. Okay? So one of the things we have to do is find strategies. Once we learn something wrong, we need to find ways to replace it. Okay. All right. So replacing habits is actually a bit of a challenge. Arnold Jacobs figured out something that really works well for us. He talked about strangeness. Okay, strangeness. Well, you may think this is strange talk. That's okay. I'm a college professor. I'm used to that. One of the things that happens when we do something and we get comfortable with it, okay, we're very comfortable with it. We know what we sound like We hold the trombone the same way. We've done these things. They're very comfortable to us. They're old habits, right? Right. So to change that, we have to make that new and different. We have to make it strange. So in this case, what you want to do is be able to replace that habit. You need to move yourself into a learning space, or your student into a learning space, where they can shift the neural input into the brain. Okay, there I'm using big words again. We're going to take the sensory input, and instead of what we started, we're going to shift it. So here's some ideas. Okay, so instead of just bringing it in through our ears, how about we bring it in through our eyes? Well, let's give you some examples. Hi.
Hello, John.
John, here. Ever seen one of these?
I have.
You have? You ever used one of these? Good. Okay. So, you want to talk about moving wind, right? Well, we need a visual aspect. So, move some wind. Okay. Now that's up close to your face, so that's like you're alive. You're going to hold it like this, arms length. Okay? No. Okay. So, we can make a crescendo. Okay? And do you listen to the sound you're making? Is that a musical sound? Try it again. How would you describe the tone?
Spread a little bit. Not as
Is it bright or dark?
probably a little bit brighter.
Edgy, warm.
Probably a little bit colder.
Edgy.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Okay, would you use those words to something you liked in your trombone playing?
Probably.
Right, try it again. Different approach. Yeah, okay, so different. How about... Okay, so we can create a different sort of effect. Now what I want you to do is double tongue about a whole bar 16 times. Interesting. Interesting, right? Okay, why don't you relax? Okay? There. Okay. So there are a couple things going on. First of all, you're seeing the result. This is really new and different for you, right? You're thinking about blowing totally different, right? Okay, so it's kind of a mind bender. This is something D. Stewart came up with, and this thing is you can't fool it. If your ear is bad, it will not move. Okay? Try pianissimo. Right? Okay. You want to get a note started right away. If you have the wah attacks where you can see it, get up to speed. Yeah. And you did less, and what happened there? More happened. Okay. So it will tell you lots, okay, in this case. So that's a visual stimulus. We could also do it the low-cost version with a piece of paper, you know, right? I don't want to get into the old idea of pinning one against the wall, but if I want to see whether, if I'm doing a phrase, you know that row shoot, and I'm putting my legato tonguing in there, if that caves in on me, I'm going to see. You can try that with a pinwheel. Can you do that? And just for the sake of experiments, legato tongue every note. Did I say it was humbling? Okay, 2 gifts for the road there. Thanks. Next time. Right. We turned the problem around on its head, brought it in through our eyes, and we made it strange. Okay, in this case, with a visual idea. A couple other ideas. A tuner can give you that idea. If you use tonal energy and you get the cool little smiley face, that's a great one. The spectral analyzer, a waveform graph, if you want to see the shape of your notes, if you want to see the spectrum of your sound. All of these things give you different ways. Okay? And you can think of creative ways. But the main principle is that we're bringing it through our eyes.
The way that you can do this is by using your other senses. For example, touch. And so we do a lot of wind patterning, or at least we have done a lot of wind patterning on the palm of your hand or sometimes the back of your hand if that's more comfortable. And then you can really feel if there's huge gaps in the air. You can try the same kind of exercise with legato tongue or double tonguing, that kind of thing can be really helpful.
Yeah. As an experiment, let's do this all together. You know the roshu we just mentioned, right? Can you just blow that with the air and the tongue on your hand, but not up close? That means, okay, I'm alive, you know, the test, the police are happy. No, out here, arms length. Okay, so here we go. 1, 2. Okay, feels very different from the trombone, right? Now we're probably using, I don't know, a very large amount more air than we would when we play the trombone. But that's part of the point. That's strange, that's different. We're making it as different from playing the trombone as possible. So we go back to the trombone, all of a sudden, it's like, oh wow, I'm free to change. Okay? Now one of the things about these approaches here, as you move into this strange new zone, you're going to have to repeat it enough times for a good old self 2 to grab onto it. So you can't blow through that passage once and say, ah, that's fixed, I'm cured. Dr. Trombone, I'm cured. No, it doesn't work that way. You're going to have to do that 3 or 4 times. And so in your practice, when you find that spot that doesn't work the way you want it to do, or you learned it wrong, you're going to have to practice over that spot with a number of correct repetitions. And we talk in the book, and this is from my experience, if there's a magic number we all have, and it's usually between 3 and 7, except for one of my students where it's more like 11 or 13. Times you have to repeat this to get it. You will find that yourself. And it may start out 7 times, 10 times. The old 10 out of 10 times practicing strategy had some merit. And then that may work down as you get more effective at this. But the point is, as you're playing, the minute it stops being effective, you need to stop and move away from what you're doing, make it strange, okay? And then practice that and replace that habit. Okay? A couple other suggestions here. You can alter the sound. Okay? Putting mute in can really help. It's just totally random. So when I put the mute in, okay, I can sort of tell where things are.
If you can get the mute to really buzz, that's one indicator that it's actually happening. So if you've got a student playing into their mute, but it's this sort of stuffy sound, they're not really getting the full benefit of that exercise.
And they'll find that they can also then go back and mix and match these different methods. Changing the acoustic, there happens to be no resonance in this room, so going to a room that had some resonance would be great. Even changing the way you practice. If you practice in a room and your chair faces the same way every day, you can change your experience by changing the direction of the chair. That's actually been studied. So there are a lot of different things you can do. Buzzing is a great one. There's a number of great buzzing debates. Okay, well, whether it matches the trombone or not, which is kind of irrelevant, it's different, and it allows me to change my experience. It allows me to focus my brain on something that I can then change. So I can take the tonguing in, I can leave it out. It's kind of a different way to play with it. So what I'm trying to do is to get myself unstuck in the sense of strangeness so I can change things, or my student. And I think this is something that Arnold Jacobs was a master at. If you read the book Legacy of the Master by Guy Stewart, you'll notice a lot of the strategies that he used with some very famous brass players to basically trick them into allowing themselves to play, okay, to get them out of their bad habit. And so these are some ideas. Time stretched or half-speed recording is another one. Half-speed recording is great. It's a little hard on the ego, but it's great. Okay, so a few other examples. And these are pretty straightforward. To change something, play it backwards. You can retrograde it. Take a short passage and play it in reverse. Particularly if you have trouble finding a certain pitch. Well, start with that pitch, establish it, and play it backwards from there. 3, 4, 5, 7 times, and then go back and play it forward, see what happens. Right? You can change the key of a piece. Try playing the ride in B flat. You can play it one-handed, it's great. Right? That Rochu etude in E major, or in B major, just shift it to E flat and see what you sound like. And then say, well, why don't I sound like that in E major? Right? Again, it's an easy thing to do. Sometimes you can distract students. Okay? I embarrassed Julia one time in a Masterclass where I made her stand on a chair and play the tuba mirror.
I was definitely traumatized, but it sounded really good.
She was so worried about staying on the chair that she didn't think a bit about playing the trombone. And so it came out beautifully. Right? These things sometimes only work once. You can also add some motion. Okay? A lot of times, motion can distract you, but it can also loosen you up. You might play something where you're moving an arm or you're moving around. Okay? I once at the Picorni seminar had a young trombonist who was playing the bolero solo and was very, very tense about it. So we decided we would do the Radio City Music Hall version. Sounded brilliant. Right. So the thing is, it was in there, but we were so locked up in the concentration of what we were doing, we were so forced into that habit that we weren't able to allow our playing to happen. Okay. So there's a lot of different strategies there, but these are some things that you can experiment with. We live in an era where we have more gadgets and technology, we have access to more information, and particularly with the internet, there are an awful lot of ideas floating around out there. Some of them are good, some of them are wacko. And I think the challenge is that you have to be able to determine just between news and maybe whatever fake news is, I don't know. It all seems to be, we label things different terms, but you need to be literate in being able to decide what is useful and what isn't. But one of the trends that you will see is let's use a lot of gadgets. Let's use a lot of breathing gadgets, and let's use a lot of machines and a lot of technology. And they can be very helpful, and used wisely, they can be enormously useful. But I think you have to be careful. And the idea that I think anybody that ever had a lesson with Arnold Jacobs, he would always say this, and being the most famous person for sort of introducing these gadgets, he would always say that if given the adequate time, he would prefer to teach it through musical means. So I think our goal is to become artistic and musical, not athletic. I don't think we can underscore that.
In certain situations, you could say the same thing for buzzing, whereas you don't want to be a buzzing athlete, but you can use it as a tool. And I think keeping in mind the use of all these things is really important.
Yeah. Buzzing is solfege, as musicianship. Okay. All right. So, now in full disclosure, a great deal of my undergraduate degree was in the physics department. And so I got interested in a lot of those aspects of this. So I want to take you through something about air and wind as we're talking about this, and some actual research. Jacobs would always say that for any given note on any instrument at a certain dynamic level, you would use the same air volume and pressure to play that note. And then that basically the concept was as you played a higher note, the air pressure inside of your mouth, the intraoral air pressure would increase, and the volume would decrease, or the rate of flow. And the reverse would happen when you went to the low range. That research was never published, but in 2012, a group, Kruger, McLean, and Kruger, actually confirmed this, and I'll show you their results, that this is actually true. They also found that you need a minimum amount of air pressure and air volume to get a note to play. So this is how your instrument starts the tone and works. We're not talking about resonance at this point, we're talking about getting the air to play. All right, so my students always know I'm always drawing charts and graphs on the board, and they think it's pretty funny. This is really, in a nutshell, what McLean and McLean found, or Kruger, McLean, Kruger. This takes a little bit of explanation. So let's go through this carefully and take a minute. Okay, of these three graphs, along this axis, top to bottom, you're at the same time in a note. So three notes are being played. Okay, you'll see a low D, a middle D, and a high D. And they're being played and crescendo. That's what's being tracked here. Okay? So if I look at, for example, the low D chart here, that's this line. On this one, it's that black line. And here, it's actually the lower line. So if I look at it at 2 seconds into the note, okay, those 3 points line up. What you're seeing on the top chart is the airflow. So this is in liters per second. This is the volume of air that you're moving. The middle chart is the sound pressure level. So this is in decibels. This is how loud the note is. Okay? And that one's a little bit tricky because our ear is more sensitive to the high D, which is why the high D is down here. Okay? That's a different discussion, but this is loudness. The bottom one is the intraoral air pressure. Okay? So that's the air pressure built up inside of your mouth while you're playing the note. When we have the low note, at peak volume, we have the highest airflow. And when we have the highest note, we have the lowest airflow. Inversely, when we're looking at pressure, at peak volume, the high note has the highest pressure and the low note has the lowest pressure. Okay? You can do this experiment for yourself with a mouthpiece. So if you were to, for example, buzz a note and feel how much air is coming out, there's a fair amount of air. A lot less. Hardly any. Okay? So that flow has been greatly reduced. Right? So the point of this chart, once we understand the relationship of what we're doing high to low, is that if we were to assume that this particular performance here was the ideal, balanced, most efficient way of playing the instrument, okay? Being on one of those lines for any given loudness and note, you would be at the perfect place where the instrument was being efficient. Now, if you're above that or below that, meaning you have too much flow, too much pressure, too little pressure, then things get out of whack. And that's when we begin to compensate and we have problems in our playing. Okay? So, for example, how many of you have gone to play a high note really loud, gone at it with everything you had, and absolutely nothing came out? You know that, right? That's a common experience, right? Okay. What have you done? Well, you have so much airflow and or pressure that you basically have to hold that back, and you've killed all vibration in your embouchure. Okay? So you're basically above these points in the chart. So more air than your system can handle. What about, say, for example, puffing your cheeks? Does that come from weak cheek muscles? Not really. It comes from having too much air volume flowing through your system. It's got to go somewhere. Right? So within this context, we've got some examples here of how we compensate. So again,
So really, what does this all mean, basically? I'll admit that I have a really hard time understanding the chart. I'm not very sciencey, and so I'm like, okay, what is this actually telling me about trombone? Basically, the airflow and the pressure need to match what the note is on your horn, and pressure not being mouthpiece pressure, which I'm a little bit worried that it'll be sort of a misunderstanding there, but like the pressure within your mouth, behind your lips, I don't really get it. It has to match, though, and you know when you have too much or too little, and you can sort of tell with how the note sounds and various other factors.
okay. So we've got sort of three big categories here that turn out of this. When you have too much airflow, when you have too much air pressure, too little airflow. Now remember, we're being all sciencey to give you the background. I think a lot of these words have problems, and we'll get to that in a minute. Okay? So, typical things that happen when we have too much airflow. Okay? These should all be sort of familiar. Okay? The puffing the cheeks is an example that I just used. If you've got too much going on, then it's got to go somewhere, so we tend to puff. Okay? What about too much air pressure? Well, we still have the embouchure that doesn't work very well. But a lot of times we create so much pressure inside the mouth that it's really difficult to articulate a note. So it's hard to get notes started. It's hard to tongue fast. Or the example of the high note where nothing speaks. You have air leaking through the nose. This is typically what's going on. A lot of times tonguing problems are related to just blowing too hard. We'll talk about that in a minute. Too little airflow. This is the one everyone's familiar with. This is the 6th grade, band student that kind of has the soggy pitch and everything comes in flat and underneath. Right? So in this case, more air is the answer. In the other cases, we've got to find the right air. Right? So we need strategies to match the air to the note. Okay. All right, now I'm going to throw another complicated concept at you. Okay. One of the things that a lot of us do when we blow too hard is we find a way to compensate for that. Now, what are we taught in band class? We're taught to move a lot of air, use more air, breathe from the diaphragm, all these sorts of things. We have marching bands, drum corps, things like that. We're really reinforcing that. And the idea that we're communicating to our students is that you should use a lot of muscle activity when you're doing this to move air through there. Okay, well, we're good. We've got these great students. They want to please us, so they want to feel that they're doing this activity. So one of the curious things that happens is that we actually use the voice to take advantage of something called the Bernoulli effect to actually slow down the air so that we can survive our tendency to overblow. So we're going to do an experiment. This is, by the way, actually how an airplane flies. Airplanes are not pushed up into the air. They're actually sucked up into the air by creating a lower pressure zone above the wings. Okay? So what is going to happen here, if you can imagine, this is in the first column, pipe section 1, this is your lungs going through your windpipe. Section 2 is where your vocal cords are. Okay? And section 3 is in your mouth just before it hits your embouchure. Okay? Now we're going to assume for this that section 1 and section 3 are the same size. That the area in your throat, the area in your mouth are the same size, just for this exercise. Okay? Ideally, you would think, I'm going to blow through all of that. It's going to be one size pipe. The air is going to come out. right? Okay? But when we engage the voice, the flaps of the vocal cords restrict the throat and decrease the area. And that's going to create a change in pressure and flow. Okay? So when it comes back to that, we will have, when it returns to pressure in the third section, we will have lost a lot of volume. Okay? Let's do the experiment. So what I want you to do is blow on your hand. So a nice big, quarter-sized airstream. Nice and easy. So you have one, if you don't have any sound, you should have one nice free and easy airstream, right? Everybody can do that? It's just like I'm doing. All right, now as you're doing that, what I want you to do is introduce the voice by saying ha. So it'll sound like, okay? Tell me what happens to the air. Feel the bottom drop out of the airstream?
Yeah.
Okay. You just did this.
If you've ever been told to fog up a mirror, that's kind of exactly what you're doing, which is a little unfortunate.
Warm, moist air. Okay. So what have we done? You feel like you're blowing hard, right? You feel like you're working hard. But when you introduce the voice, you've severely reduced the airflow to the embouchure. Okay. This is one of the worst ways of compensating. So if we actually engage the voice, we really mess up the process. So we're working really hard to generate a lot of air, then we're wasting it in this process to just survive at the embouchure. Okay? So the great players play really relaxed. Their air just matches the note, they're not messing around with the voice, everything works fine. Okay? But this is a situation where sometimes we misdiagnose this by not understanding the principle of what we're doing. Okay? Now, do you really need to tell an 11-year-old kid that they're doing the Bernoulli effect when they're playing their Sousa March? No, I don't think so. But we have to understand this to know what's going on, okay? So a lot of times, you're trying to generate a lot of feeling that you're working hard inside, and then we defeat it ourselves. So that brings us to muscles. Okay, so we have a little physics, a little psychology, now a little physiology. Okay? Things you need to know. Okay? Muscles can only contract and relax. They can't push. Okay? Which is why muscles are almost always in pairs. So an active muscle is a muscle that is contracting. So if you say do something, something is contracting. Okay? Right? Muscles work in pairs. If I'm moving my arm, the muscles on the inside contract, on the outside they relax, and vice versa, moving the other way. Which is why a lot of times when you're playing your slide, you will have trained one set of muscles, a location outbound, and a different set of muscles will have a different location inbound. So if you watch a player, all of their in and outbound positions will be in different locations. Make a video of yourself sometimes. You'll be intrigued. Right? All right. Here's an interesting one. The system, specifically Self-2, that controls the muscles, those do not understand modifiers. What do I mean by modifier? That's don't, not, things like that. So if you tell yourself, don't play a B natural, what does your body hear? Play a B natural. Don't miss that note. Just miss that note. Don't tense up. It hears tense up. Okay? Fascinating stuff, huh? Explains a lot of things that we do. Okay? And then the last one is that when we have those pairs in opposition, we create isometric tension. You're using both muscles. They're both contracting, but you're going nowhere. Okay? If you've ever tried to hold a heavy object out statically, how long can you do that? Not very long. You can do this a lot, but you can't do that even with your mouthpiece for very long. Okay? So there's some concepts here that you need to be aware of. Okay? So that extends us to this issue of being tongue-tied. Right? The tongue happens to be one of the largest muscles in your body. It's actually attached down here near your collarbone. And it's made up of 6 muscle groups. Did you notice? 6 muscle groups. Okay. You're going to throw a lot of big fancy words at you. Feel free to ignore them. These are in 2 groups. Intrinsic, which basically translates to they're inside your mouth, and extrinsic, meaning they're anchored outside of your mouth. Whoa, wait a minute. My tongue muscles are outside my mouth? What? Okay. If you haven't watched one of these MRI videos with Sarah Willis and the MRI machine, do it. It's really fascinating. A little disturbing. Okay. All right, so the 3 sets of muscles inside your mouth, okay? We don't even need to know the names here. The inferior and superior longitudinal muscle. Great, okay. Goes length of tongue, moves the tip of the tongue up and down. See? Well, that's useful, right? That's where I'm actually trying to tongue, right? Tip of the tongue touches something. Okay, then I've got a transverse muscle across the tongue. Well, why do I have to narrow it and lengthen it? I'm going up and down, right? So I don't need that one. Okay. The vertical muscle goes up and down, flattens and depresses. I might need that one for high and low. Okay. But wait, there's more. Now you got the ones with the big names. This one attaches genioglossus from the chin to the tongue. Okay, so stick out your tongue and feel what activates down here. Everybody do that? How many times did you do that in a trombone class? All right. All right. So that's one you probably really don't need to use. Okay, interesting. All right. Styloglossus. It's attached behind the ear. It goes under here. Okay. So when you pull the tongue upward and back, try that. You'll feel all this attached here. Okay. We've got another one that pulls it back to groove it. Another one that retracts and depresses it. Okay. So all of these can be active. Okay. Do you need to know the names? Do we need to have a test? No. What you need to be aware of, though, is that there's a lot of stuff at play, and you don't need a lot of this. Okay? So one of the challenges that we get comes from the fact that this sophistication of these systems has a lot to do with speech. What do we do when we speak? Well, we create consonants and vowels, which we tend to teach our articulation with, and then we also create facial expressions. Okay? So if you say the word TWO, two, and you say it like you're in a diction class in Victorian England, two. Can you everybody say that? Like you're really trying hard to pronounce it. Two. Okay. Do you feel all sorts of activity all over the place? Okay. Try it a couple times. Two. Two. Okay. Right. You'll feel stuff down here, back here, under here, over here. Okay. And so one of the things that we unintentionally do when we're teaching articulation by asking somebody to say ta or tu or ta or to or da or do or whatever syllable we're using is we're running into two different things. If they pronounce that very carefully, depending on their dialect, which will vary definitely from Texas to California to New York. I'm from Indiana, and I will not demonstrate that accent. But we will move a lot of these things that we actually don't need when we maybe just need one or two of these systems. Okay? So by using the syllables, we can actually lead ourselves down to a problematic path. Now we couple that with the vowel. So what happens when we go, oh? What did I do? Bernoulli, I just killed my airstream. And I can't tell you how many young students I hear that are actually saying and singing along nowadays. Okay, so we want to really stay away from that if we can. Right? So how do you do it? Well, there's an interesting thing. The consonant T is an unvoiced syllable, so you can make the T sound without using your voice or moving the air. You go. Okay. It's just tongue contact, and hopefully it's just the one system in front. So what do I want for articulation? I want, right, and, which is different from tu, tu, tu. And we can argue about what Arvin meant by tu, you know, but if I actually say tu, I get chu, 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 which I don't want.
Well, and the important thing, I think, to mention is that this is different for everybody. And while you do need to use diction sometimes to teach things, you can't just be like, do this thing with your tongue that I'm doing. See, look at this, do it. You know, you have to be aware of the potential for all of these different things to happen, especially with a student that really wants to do what you're asking them to do. They'll be overblowing, they'll be over-articulating. Right. All these things are possible.
And that's a really perceptive comment because, you know, here I've just unloaded a whole bunch of Latin names at you that you really don't need to know. Young student, you know, you can feel your articulation. Right? And you feel the air flowing, not da, 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 da. Right? It's going to be obvious right away. Because if I do that, you see it slow down. Nothing's happening.
These pinwheels are way too good.
We got ball bearing pinwheels. Just joking. So some of our traditional methods, we haven't really questioned them enough. Okay, we've just really kind of accepted them because, well, I was taught that way, so that's how I'm going to teach. We tend, as a profession, not to teach our students how to teach. Right? And sometimes we guard our secrets.
So what does all this mean? Basically, it's important information for us all to have as teachers, but it's not something that we need to tell students, particularly if you don't want them to get into the analysis paralysis zone. It's been really interesting actually working on this and the book and all of this stuff. As a teacher, I've learned a whole lot, but then when I go to play, I really have to turn it off and think of the music and think of what I'm actually trying to do sound-wise. Because if I think to myself, don't engage your stylioglossus, whatever, like, it's never going to happen. And so I think words matter, and we talked about intraoral pressure. That's an important concept, but I personally don't say pressure to a student ever if I can avoid it, because of all the different things that they can hear when I say that. Also, we talked about more air or the right air. You can use motion words like wind and flow and lift, like it says there. They're not static the way the air is. Point being, basically, take the knowledge, but don't necessarily get too overly analytical in the lesson.
Right. So it's kind of like when you're a medical doctor. I was joking. I'm the second Dr. Glendening in my family, but my father, who was also a trombone player, was a medical doctor. He has an MD, I have a DM. I fix trombones, I don't fix people. But the doctor knows all sorts of things that they're not going to tell you about your condition. But they're going to tell you, yeah, you really need to exercise and eat right. Okay? Things that come down to your level. So the question of how we diagnose things, I think, is really fascinating. And a lot of times we jump to the wrong conclusion. So little information goes a long way. So what we want to do is bring this all the way around and talk about applying this and designing effective exercises or redesigning some of our famous exercises. And to do this, a couple guidelines. A good exercise needs to be simple. Your student needs to be able to repeat it correctly. We talked about correct repetitions, and they need to be able to repeat it correctly without you. So it needs to be as foolproof as possible. You know, the old adage of practicing slow so your progress can be fast is a great one, right? Finding this way to simplify things, make it different, just get it down to something that we can do correctly a number of times is a really important concept. So if you get that guided study from an early age, you'll have great results. And some of our most famous players that come up with this had great resources from the beginning. Some other students will come up through the band programs in the back row and not have a lesson until, oh gosh, I'm going to audition for college next week, I better get a lesson. And then we become a repair shop in college. And so somewhere on that spectrum, we need to apply these things. Okay. So thinking in terms of this, good concepts are to take something apart, disassemble it. Okay? Right? You know, the wind pattern we talked about, articulation practice away from the horn. Buzzing a passage in the mouthpiece of the visualizer. Okay? The mouthpiece has some resistance, the visualizer has no resistance. Do you really need to look at it in a mirror so it looks a certain way? No, but it sounds totally different. Okay, we all know and love that tune. You got a visualizer, though, right?
I do.
You buzz on the visualizer. Oh, go get it. Like a well-oiled machine. I'll talk about another one we'll do. And also, you know, break it apart. So I might think. So I'm linking that with my concept. Again, different ways to reassemble it. So the difference between you get a totally different sound, and you get a totally different set of feedback. Right? It's the difference here, the creating strangeness in a different way that allows you to work with this and to explore your own approaches, or to take that student that just isn't quite getting it and to be able to turn them a little bit and so that they can work with this. Yeah?
You've often talked about taking away variables just to make it an easier thing, and I've said that to students a lot, and it seems to really work. Just to have that sort of mindset that there's so many variables involved in playing. If something isn't working, you kind of have to piece it apart.
Exactly. So this breaking it down concept is an important one. And then finally, I think a lot of times we make the mistake of trying to work on fundamental issues on repertoire. Right? Take it away from the piece. Take it away to a fundamental exercise, solve the problem there, and then come back and play the music. So that the music remains art, and we're not turning some of our best solo pieces or even worse, the excerpts that we play over and over and over again. We turn them into technical exercises, and then when we expunge all the musicianship from them, take that technical problem over to an A2 book or write something. Good example of this was Schlossberg. Schlossberg didn't sit down one day and write a book of technical studies. He, as students came in, would take out a piece of manuscript paper and write an exercise for them to work on their problem. After he died, the son-in-law compiled these into the book that we know today. Right? That's a different process. Make yourself an exercise to solve the problem, or better yet, make your student one. Okay. So here's 3 examples of foolproof exercises. Okay. Now I'm sure some creative trombonists can screw these up. Okay. I'm not going to guarantee this, but I will give you a couple examples. Okay. This is one that I use, which is to help a student through this so they don't do the having the voice and finding the acoustic center of the trombone. And that is to use this target practice drawing. So what I do is I will ask the student to breath attack a note. Right? So this pitch center is where the instrument is set, the line across there. If I hit the note right, that's where the instrument wants to play it. If that's in the wrong place, I need to move my tuning slide or my hand slide. Okay? Now, if I come in above that, which may mean that my face is too tight, or I'm blowing too hard, or the air is too fast, things like that, I will push it into a brighter tone and then eventually into the pinched, edgy zone that you know. Okay? If I'm pushing it down, either by lipping it down or by having the wrong air, I will push it underneath the note. Okay? At the same time, the breath attack is going to tell me whether I've got an actually good air delivery. So if I get an accent on a breath attack, I know I've overblown the air, I've misshaped it. If I get a wah, you know that the air is not starting right away. So as you start this, you might even just try modeling it. It should come right in, and if I let this go, it'll go right to the center of the instrument. Okay? And then if I get it wrong, let me bend the pitch around. You hear as it went up, it pinches and closes up. Right? So there's a pitch center there. We might model this back and forth. But the key thing here is by taking out the articulation, I'm using the breath attack to tell me a lot of different information. Okay? If my air really matches the note, I'll get a perfect, beautiful note. If my air is off, it's going to tell me one of a number of different things on the target practice drawing. I thought it was appropriate to do target practice at the Army meeting.
I found this useful with my brass method students, actually. Even though they are total beginners to the trombone, they can still find somewhere on the instrument that they get a decent tone, and then using that as a reference for whether or not they're lipping certain things has been really helpful. So going from somewhere that's successful and building upon that to use this diagram is a pretty good approach, I found.
Right. We're also modeling, we're starting with not, say, ta, which is kind of potentially problematic. We're starting with blowing simple air in there, 11-year-old can get that. Here's another one that's foolproof. Okay. This is Caruso. This is Carmine Caruso, not Enrique Caruso. Okay. Caruso was a saxophone player that taught a lot of famous, particularly trumpet players in New York. And he has a whole book, but the most interesting exercise, the first one, is called the 6 Notes. And there's some people that are very diehard about this, but the curious thing about this is the reason this is foolproof is for one reason here. It's because you breathe through your nose. Okay? So let's do an experiment. If I ask you to breathe through your mouth, I want you to take about a half a breath, and I want you to hold it for a second, and then try to blow out. Okay? So halfway in. What happens? You get all this, you feel like you're locked up, right?
Even a little bit.
Yeah. Even, you can take a small breath. All right? It's like you set the parking brake on the car. Okay? Well, that's a thing called the Valsalva maneuver, and it's a body reflex. And it's isometric tension. You are breathing in and blowing out at the same rate to hold that air with your mouth open. Okay? To deactivate that, you either have to not stop. If you take a breath and you don't stop, you can turn it around and stay in motion. You have to feel the air coming in on the red part of your lips. Or you have to be 100% full. Bruckner Symphony Chorale there. Okay, technique. But anything in between there, you will lock up. Okay? Now, as a reverse, let's try it through our nose. Try breathing through your nose. So take half a breath, pause, and try blowing out through your mouth. So in through your nose, out through your mouth. Wait a minute, no problem, no luck. I can do that any which way. What's going on? By breathing in through your nose, you bypass the nerves in your vocal cords. This is the problem. So when you breathe in, try that. Just say H, breathe in. You feel the resistance in the lock? You're triggering that. It would be the same thing as if you had something in your throat and you're choking on it. It's a body mechanism. Okay? But when you bypass the voice, you can't do it. Okay? So in this case, you actually can't do the Bernoulli thing because you use your nose to fix this. It's absolutely brilliant. And I don't think he had any idea what he actually did here. Okay? So in this exercise, what we do is we breathe in through our nose. We have the embouchure on the horn, and we're going to start with the embouchure in place. We're never going to take it off the horn. It was very much about starting this in place, so you didn't move your embouchure as you're starting the notes. Right? We're going to breath attack the first note after breathing through our nose, then we'll tongue the next two. Then we'll repeat the process, and then we'll move the pitch around. Right? So that's what I'm looking for. For students that start the notes both with their lips closed and tonguing, this is a great solution for that. Right? And then you can move the pitch around. And as you do this, you'll find that you can calm a lot of things down. And you can get over this fear of tonguing with a ha, ta, ta, because you brought it in through the nose. Interesting exercise. Remington, our most famous, let's play this back over. Perhaps one of our most famous exercises that we have. I would argue that this has been one of our most dangerous exercises. And that may be kind of heretical, but I think one of the things that this exercise does is it tends to teach pitch matching instead of good tone. Okay? And so when you give this to a little kid without supervision and you ask them to play back and forth, they're just playing these locations of pitches they might not even be able to reach because they're too small. And as they do that, what do? They repeat them. As they repeat them, they learn habits. And then they go into band class and we try to make them match pitch. And so how do they match pitch? Their habit is to put the slide in the wrong position. Then they're going to lift the note up or down. And then they're playing. It's really difficult to get a good tone after that. So we can redesign this exercise to make it foolproof. And so in this case, I'm going to do two things. Right? I'm going to take away the ability to use the voice by using a breath attack, as we've already hopefully learned from the target practice. I could even go so far as apply the Caruso to the front end of this and breathe through the nose. Although with a young kid, that's a problem because then they'll do that and they'll actually not take a proper breath. Right? But in this case, we're going to breath attack the first one, and then I'm going to use a glissando to find the position. Why the glissando? It's so I can't lip the notes. Right? Because if I'm going to lip the note as a glissando, I will get the kind of the 6th grade band sound. That kind of out of sync sort of sound. Right? And so the easiest way to do this with a student is just to play back and forth. Let's see if we're in tune. You're flat on high. California versus Arizona pitch. Things here. I'm providing the sound, so the model is already there. All she has to do is repeat that. Right? If we repeat that enough times, what happens? It becomes a habit. Now we could also use a tuner. Right. Now there's an arrow.
Errors.
Yeah, there's an error. These arrows should be shifted over. They should be when you get to the next note.
Because checking a tuner during a gliss is really useful.
Right. Okay. So that is an error. Well, one of the things, you glitch down and then look over at the tuner and see if you have your smiley face. Okay? If you get that 10 out of 10 times, I guarantee your playing will improve substantially in a very short amount of time. Okay? That fifth position that we don't know where it is, well, we can do that. You can model this for an entire trombone class, a trombone choir. Right? Just play these, play them back to them. Right? Then you're asking them to use their ears. Okay? We can do a variation of that. Again, we've got the same tuner, arrows in the wrong place. Okay, what was wrong with that?
I don't know.
You tongued it.
Calm down.
So it's still flat. Right. So one of the tricky things here is a lot of times the students never quite get back to the pitch. Right? Right. So that's all really all we're doing. Then it becomes simple. All we have to do is repeat the sound. Okay? Right. So again, a few simple things. The breath attack, the glissando. Now, if you take that approach, you could foolproof any lip slur that you ever did. Okay? You can do this in a handful of stages. So this might be the early stage. Once you get comfortable with this, turn the glissando into an imaginary glissando. Right? So you're processing that in your mind, but you're not actually playing. Right? And then you begin to develop the ability to say, I know exactly what sound I want whenever. And then so in my mind I'm thinking, except in a trombone sound, and my arm immediately goes to the right place. I've built that habit correctly on all fronts. See how that works? Right? So we can take a pretty good but somewhat dangerous exercise and we can turn it into a great exercise. Here are 3 examples of things that we do as a profession that have unintended results. Okay, so when you learn trombone, where did they tell you 7th position was? As far as you could reach, right? Okay, so what did you do? You repeated as far as you could reach. How tall were you when you were learning the trombone? Okay. I had one student, my first college teaching job, he was a graduate student, and his 7th position was literally 5th position. It was amazing how strong his embouchure was to bend that down to 7th position, but he still had the 11-year-old position. Okay, so if we're telling them something random and asking them to repeat it, we should not be surprised when they learn something random. Right? Breathe through the diaphragm. How many times have we heard that? Okay, can everyone wiggle your diaphragm? Nope. Good try, though. Would be better. Okay. Can you make it flip upside down? Can you make it? You don't have any direct control over this. So why are we even talking about it? Right? But what happens is we have the unintended consequence of that student that wants to please you as their music teacher is going to do something that gives them feedback and usually involves some amount of stress and maybe even pain. So what are they going to do? They're going to tighten everything up and then put a lot of effort into it.
That's one that you could see with the pinwheel or with your hand or whatever else, that they're working super hard, but they're just not getting the result.
Yeah. So if you apply the diaphragm, you can see it die. But if I'm, in the what we call the bark lounger mode, it works just fine.
You can feel it really easy on your hand too.
Yeah. So you're engaging these muscles. You basically tie down. You tie down the airflow. And the last one is another interesting one. Open your throat. Okay. Well, if you're opening your throat, what are you doing? You're asking muscles to be active. What happens when muscles are active? They contract. So what are we doing when we say open your throat? We're contracting muscles in our throat. How does that even make sense? Right? So the concept is good, but because we're sending messages to a muscle group in a way that's kind of counterproductive, we actually have the opposite result. What you're saying is, yeah, relax, do nothing. So in a lot of cases, the place where we're the most relaxed, the most open, and most productive is when we're doing almost nothing. Okay? Which is a really interesting concept. And of course, I think most of us, if you've been around some of the great brass players, they're usually the most relaxed.
One of my favorite quotes about trombone playing is from John Rojak's website, and he says, playing the bass trombone should be as close as possible to being asleep.
Okay. So there are many more of these things, and we go into a lot of different details, a lot more things in the book, and I want to thank Pierre Cotel and International Music Diffusion for publishing this. It's available at Hickey's Music. They've got a special price for the ATW right now. The new printing is just out, and we're very happy to have this available.
In terms of playing with speed on the trombone, which can be problematic in terms of some other instruments, what about the use you have on how to practice speed?
Well, you start slowly. It has to be correct first, then you can get it fast. This is the learning to walk before you run sort of thing. So in other words, you have to repeat what you're actually doing slowly so it's correct.
Well, I have, remember reading that, looking at some pretty good musicians have a different approach to that in terms of, in addition to slowing it down, to split your lick into small groups.
Right, that would work as well. So you're simplifying.
Yeah.
You're simplifying, you're shortening it out. I think the interesting thing, though, is the idea of actually turning up the metronome slowly actually isn't really how your brain gets it. Because once your brain has got it, it's in there. So at that point, then, things that keep you from playing fast usually are tension. So in other words, if, say, for example, you're talking about slide technique, if you have tension in your arm, it's not going to move very fast. Right? And then technical things like if you have awkward slide positions in a fast technical passage, so you're constantly turning the slide around, it'll make it very difficult to play. So the faster you go, the more you have to sort of smooth those out. So there are a whole lot of different things at play, and it depends sort of where you are at as a player when you're trying to do this technical feat. But I think if you build it up slowly, so in other words, you're doing correct repetitions of the passage you're trying to play, which includes playing it accurately, playing it rhythmically correct, playing it pitch correct, playing it dynamically correct, articulation correct, relaxation correct, right, volume, etc. Doing all those things at whatever tempo until it really gets in your brain.
Right.
I think that's going to be the best approach, at least in terms of building a solid foundation. Now, after that, you can start applying all the gimmicks.
Right. The one concern that I remember being brought up with that is that practicing slow doesn't always result in you learning the same muscle motions that have to happen when you have to play something fast.
Well, you are going to have to practice it fast at some point. There's no doubt about that. But you have to learn it right first. And I don't know how you can learn a passage accurately if you play too fast. Because what happens when you play something faster than you're capable of? You make mistakes, right? And if you repeat that, what do you learn? Mistakes.
Would you say that once you do have that foundation, you could do the clicking the metronome thing up?
You could. I don't know that you have to do it a notch at a time. I think you can actually do it much faster.
Maybe like 20 clicks or something.
Yeah. You know, everyone's going to have their own sort of speed limit. But you start with it being right, and then you move from there. And I think a lot of times we say, somebody will say, oh, well, slow practice didn't help you. Well, you haven't done the slow practice correctly. So if you do slow practice very, in a very tense way to try to really point out notes and locate them, what are you doing? You're practicing tension. So we have to kind of think about what are we actually repeating. Right? The other thing is a lot of times people, when they play slow, will play short. That's a mistake. You need to play long because it's not going to get shorter. It's going to get shorter by itself. If you start short, it's going to disappear when it gets faster. So we need to kind of scale things up and down. It's not a perfect answer, but it is, I think, if you work from principles, you'll have a better chance of getting good results that are actually really great results.
Thank you.
And then the other question is you come tomorrow and ask Jim Markey how to do that because he plays really fast.
So you talked about the issues that can arise with the consonant sound of articulation.
Mm-hmm.
So then how would you introduce the concept of articulating to a beginning student without going through a consonant sound?
Well, I think I would use the unvoiced T. So, just like I did. Making that sound. You can get kids to do that, no problem, right? You get that sound and you're off the races. Right. Another thing you can work with is actually you start a note with the air and then add the tongue. Also do it on the mouthpiece so they know what it's supposed to sound like. So we're taking it away from talking about saying ta, to, whatever. So the kid's not going to... You get that kind of crazy sound.
And would the same rule apply for the double tongue signal?
Yeah. I mean, by the time you're doing multiple tonguing, they're a little more advanced, and hopefully this is secure. And so you can introduce the idea of getting the tongue to rock and getting that K in the back. Right.
I think that also getting them to think in sound, like getting them to match the unmatched syllable or unvoiced syllable, via sound might be a good approach. But I also asked you that question earlier today, like, how do you do this if you're teaching, 25th graders?
This is where it's harder, and I think you have to work with this very carefully.
Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power here, but if we choose the wrong words, even the accent you might have when you're teaching them a syllable can actually affect the whole band, how they play. So, for example, with the double tongue, this is a good tool, because usually the double tongue isn't about the tonguing, it's about keeping the air moving. So if you're going, you just got to keep it going. Right? Now that's a lot more air than I need, but it's a starting place. I get the concept and I get this idea of flow, and it's very different from the trombone. So when I come back, then I can apply that. Right? So I think you can get creative, and you also have to teach in a way that is comfortable for you, which is why I'm not saying here's the way to do it. You might have a music ed method that says you must use ta or da or to or whatever. But there are problems that arise with these. None of it's perfect. And in some places, the kids, you say ta, they'll get it just fine. In other places, they'll all actually say ah in the horn. Well, we have one more slide. This is not available yet, but we're considering this as a future slogan. So we've only gotten as far as designing the T-shirt. What do you think?
I love it.
That's for another book. This is sort of our studio joke, but really the idea of rain before trombone. This is the one thing I think. What we don't want to do is use the brute force approach of, just repeat it more, blow harder. Yeah, you're going to sound bad for 2 weeks when you do this, and then it'll get better. I've seen different things where people are making these really bad sounds, and somebody says, "Oh well, I'll do that for 2 weeks, and then it'll be so much better." Well, you're going to repeat that bad sound for 2 weeks. What are you learning? Bad sound, right? So I think we can elevate our game, and we can rethink some of these. But even if the only message you take away from this talk today is to challenge your assumptions, and to say, well, why am I actually asking this kid to do this, or why am I doing this? I think that's a really healthy sort of thing. Because a lot of times we say, well, it's because Mr. So-and-so said it to me in 1983. Okay, well, maybe I should have asked a question. All right. Thank you all for coming. Hope you learned something.